Hello, happy Tuesday, and welcome to our latest live stream. It's been a while since we've done one of these live sessions, so I'm super excited to get back into it in 2022. Can't believe it's already 2022, but anyway, I'm really excited about today's live session. We've got Chris Gillespie joining us from Fenwick. We're going to be talking about deeply understanding your readers, or how to become a subject matter overnight-ish, right? So we're going to be digging into strategies and processes for researching, understanding your readers, and then creating content that really connects with them on sort of a deep level, really understands their problems, as well as demonstrates a level of expertise about the subject that you're discussing, the topics, the industry, the verticals, etc. I think this is super valuable because as content marketers, as writers, we deal with a huge range of subjects. And of course, we all like to think that we can become experts at anything. But of course, it is a time-consuming process. It takes a while. There's a lot of research, there's a lot of thinking and experience that you need to collect to really become a subject matter expert. And to make things even more challenging, when you would normally like to pull in sort of a true subject matter expert, sometimes they're not available. It's difficult sometimes to coordinate around schedules and get insights from them. So anyway, I'm really excited to dig into what Chris has to share today, and processes and secrets and things that they use at Fenwick to really get inside the mind of the reader, understand a new industry, and become experts at sort of a world record pace. Before we go get into it, I just want to do my normal quick plug here. First and foremost, please like this video to help other people find it. Secondly, if you're not already subscribed to our YouTube channel here, please do so. We host regular live Q&As, workshops, all kinds of great content on this channel. And we're in the process right now of booking a whole bunch of great guests for the upcoming months on topics all about content marketing, SEO, writing, anything sort of in our universe as marketers. So please subscribe there and join us for future sessions. And lastly, if you are not already a member of our free content marketing community, please join us there. You can find the group at yesoptimist.com/tofu, TOFU. Top of the funnel, it's a free Slack community. Again, we host all kinds of live sessions and great things that we promote first and foremost for the community there in Slack. We also have exclusive content inside the community, Slack AMAs, question and answers, office hours, all kinds of great stuff that's happening inside that community, as well as job listings, freelance opportunities, all kinds of stuff. So if you're a content marketer, an SEO person, in-house agency, freelance, whatever, please join us there. We'd love to have you, and I think you'll get a lot of great value out of the group. All right, with my promotional hat now off, I am really pleased to introduce Chris Gillespie again from Fenwick, who'll be joining us today and leading the workshop. Hey, Chris.
Hey, Tyler. Thanks so much. Great to be invited here. I would encourage anyone who's watching this, do check out Tofu. It is a fantastic place, and there are a lot of really interesting conversations happening there.
Yeah, so, thanks so much. Yeah, as I say, Chris, you've been a member now for what, probably a year or so at least.
Yeah, it was. I like to think I was an early member. Yeah.
Indeed. Yeah. Love it. Yeah. Well, we're super excited. Real quick before we get into it, do you want to just give folks a quick background on Fenwick and kind of the work that you guys do?
Yes, we can. And then there's another little bit about it in the presentation. But Fenwick is a content studio, and we focus on uncommonly clear writing and design. And we work primarily with B2B tech startups, although some of our writers have experience outside of that. And that's the thing we love to do, write and design. And we do a lot of strategy to help clients figure out what it is they want to accomplish with that writing and design before we get into the actual producing things.
Very cool. Yeah, well, I'm excited to dig in, man. Go ahead and take it away if you're ready.
Let's do it. So, presentation is about deeply understanding your readers. So let's start off talking about what's at stake. So you write an article for the client, you hit submit, and it gets eviscerated twice. Once by the editors who can find nothing that they like about it, and then by the commenters who feel that parts of it were inaccurate or that it sounds like it wasn't written by someone in that industry. This is a constant fear of mine and has been since I started doing content writing. And so I think a lot of the process that we've developed at Fenwick is a complicated series of ways to try to get around ever getting into this situation. Because that is the best way to avoid this, is to not get into this situation where you're sending things to the clients that aren't quite ready, or putting things out into the world where people might comment and not agree with what you're saying. And so the perennial challenge is, how do you know enough at the outset and sort of become your own mini experts so that you don't get into that position? So throughout this presentation, I'll be sharing bits of this process and examples of work that we do here at Fenwick on how we try to become mini experts before we get into a project. And I would love to set an intention that there's going to be a lot of things that we share, and I would encourage you to pick one thing that you're going to try. Not a whole bunch of things, but just one thing to give a try, with the hope that you're able to write that article, send it to the client, and the reaction you get is not 3 dots of somebody about to respond and then deleting the response, but all caps praise, this is amazing. And for all the experts who are reading this thing when it goes live, even the ones who want to try to find fault with it, what you get from them is golf claps, because they couldn't find any fault. So that's the hope. So I would encourage you, pick one thing. So then the next question is, of course, why trust me? So I'm part of this content studio called Fenwick that is a collective of writers and designers. We focus on uncommonly clear writing and design. We exist to try to help everyone master that clear writing and design, and we spend an exceptional amount of time thinking about how can we make things better. I think that's why I really like being part of this team. We're about 9 people, most of us full time, is that we do something we call overlapping strategists, where there's never just one person on an account, there's always 2. Because while each of us will occasionally miss on something and have a terrible idea, it's very rare that both of us do. And so we're constantly catching each other. We're asking the question, how could this be better? Like, I see you've written this entire article, but we haven't talked to anyone at the company. Should we go deeper, find a source? And so a lot of what I share today is drawn from the work that we do. So why be your own subject matter expert? I think that Tyler alluded to a bit of this at the beginning, which is that subject matter experts are busy, right? The easy thing to do would be to always talk to them, or even have them write the article. But there's a reason that writers and designers exist. It's because those people are busy. They have a full-time job. You are probably the least of their priorities. And I would estimate that at least 70% of every project is just going back and forth. It's waiting for answers from the subject matter experts. It's hoping that they get back to you. It's them responding after a very long time with not exactly what you asked for. And so becoming your own subject matter expert is in many ways a huge time-saving device, because if you can come up with an 80% good answer and then have them review it, it saves everybody. And so that is a piece of recommendation from Karina Rampelt, our contributing editor and first employee, which is, you should know enough to take that first pass and then just use them for fact checking. You're obviously going to want to interview them and collect as much as you can, but what that does is it relieves them of something known as blank page anxiety. I'm sure everyone here has experienced this. You open the Google Doc and you want to begin and you just don't even know where to start. That's, I think, what subject matter experts who don't specialize in writing feel very often. Someone sends them something and they don't have a lot of context, and so they sit on it, and it takes weeks, it takes months. If you can take even a messy first pass and send it to them and say, is this right? It is vastly easier for them to say that's wrong and get into critiquing something than it would be for them to just invent it on their own. So we're going to go through six things that I recommend doing to become your own mini subject matter expert. And the first question first is a story about Theranos. So we're probably all familiar with this company. They raised $750 million in funding and attracted board members like the former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger before anybody asked some very basic questions like, if it works, can we see it? The only person who asked that question was this reporter in the background there, John Carreyrou. He is not a scientist. And unlike a lot of the other journalists covering this, that might have been a huge advantage for him, because he asked some questions that readers were asking, which is, does it really work? Is this true? John, I think, has a degree in political science, not the actual sciences. And so His question brought down this entire company. He continued to investigate. He kept asking. Things didn't quite add up. You obviously don't want to bring down your client, but you do want a John level of curiosity where if things aren't quite fitting, you keep asking questions and you start to learn when things don't quite make sense for you. And if you've been writing for a long time, you're probably almost rewriting the article in your head. And if it's not easy to do that, you want to keep asking. If it works, can I see it? How does it work? And keep following that. And we find that almost always leads to a very interesting place, often a place that your client hadn't thought to explore because they're so close to the product that they cannot see that this is a huge unexplored area that no one had thought to explain to others. So here are a couple of examples of headlines of articles that we wrote for one of our clients. And one of my favorite ones here is Karina's "Is Estonia the Next Silicon Valley?" The client wanted us to write about Estonia. There's a lot of materials online. Almost all of those materials are paid for by the Estonian government. Karina's take on this was her first round of the article based on those materials was very positive. And she got curious, what's it actually like? And so she hunted down a primary source of someone who had moved to Estonia, taken them up on doing their e-visa program, started a business with his partner, and then left Estonia. And so having that source allowed her to tell the actual story. E-visas sound great, but if everything's electronic, things get buggy. There's a lot of really interesting specific details to this that she wouldn't have been able to capture had she not had a John Carreyrou level of curiosity about, hey, what is this really like? If we get behind the marketing veneer, like what's the actual experience? So it's still broadly positive, but it's a much more honest article. And so that would be the point of the recommendation is follow your curiosity, keep digging until you get to a primary source and something really substantive. So number 2, figure out what's funny. A lot of spaces that we write about tend to speak in memes. And we found that it's a very useful Turing test about whether we understand the space yet, if we can tell if those are funny or not. So if we get to the memes and we're like, wow, I'm just not understanding this, that's a sign that we don't yet understand the space and we should continue going until we do. One of our writers and strategists, Danique, is the one who pointed out this insight. She actually has been developing comics for a client in the RevOps space. And what she said to me is that once she truly understood the space, that's when the humor started to kick in. She wouldn't see the meme and just not understand it. She would see it and laugh. And that's when she understood enough about the context of the world that the people they're writing for exist within to then find humor in it. So similarly, I was researching for a client that serves scientists in the research and development space. And very early on in the interview, somebody said this to me that, do you have a smart friend who just refuses to upgrade their brick phone? That's scientists. A lot of them are like that. And this didn't really resonate with me until interviewing a ton of scientists. And at the end of this research project, coming back, this made me laugh. They're technophiles at work on the cutting edge of something and absolute technophobes at home. And those are the kind of character level insights that I think really help us understand the people that we're writing for in a much more real way. And so that's the thing we're always searching for. Have you figured out what's funny and do you understand the humor? So point number 3, get in character when interviewing. A question that I always used to wrestle with in interviews is how much to prepare. Having been a salesperson, I used to feel very confident going in with 5 minutes of prep. Look up the person's LinkedIn, know what school they went to, understand roughly what the company does. Getting into writing, I was always curious, should I go so deep that I know the answer to every question that I'm about to ask, or is it okay to go in knowing nothing and allow the questions to guide the conversation? And I think where we've landed at with Fenwick is you should go in knowing what the reader knows. So if we take the RevOps example, if your audience is salespeople who don't know a lot about RevOps, then maybe going in knowing nothing is actually a pretty good strategy. Maybe you're going to ask the very basic questions that your readership would be asking. So you're acting as their advocate, you're their proxy in that conversation. If you're writing about RevOps experts for RevOps experts, you have to get on their level. You have to understand enough so that you're not asking very basic questions that are going to turn off the reader. A lot of times when I see writers doing that, what you get is an introduction to the article where it's very clear that it's just the reader explaining it, or the writer explaining the topic to themselves. And I think that if it's an expert audience, they can feel that right away, that like, oh wow, they're like postulating on like what the term RevOps stands for. This is not for me, right? It's a giant flag for that reader. So this is our rule for ourselves when we're doing interviews, is going knowing more or less what your reader knows. Beyond that, we have a senior writer and strategist, Riviera, who is fantastic at interviewing and wrote an article that I'll share after this about how to evoke really interesting things from an interview. But these are some of the points from her article. So one is ask questions designed to evoke emotions. So one of Riviera's insights is that our memories are tied to moments of high emotional salience. Very often, though, in an interview, people will ask a general question. For example, what's a challenge you face at work? That question doesn't have a lot of emotional salience, so it's very hard for the person who's being interviewed to draw up something specific or worth talking about. If you reframe that question, as Riviera recommends, to something like, "Hey, can you think back to a day when work was so bad you thought, I'm going to quit. I'm going to walk in and quit. This is awful. I cannot continue." Ask that question, and you're going to get a much more specific, meaningful, and interesting answer. And so wherever you can, think about those questions and try to make them tied to some moment of emotional valence. So number two is schedule time for off-topic banter. I think that Riviera's insight is that very often the banter at the beginning of an article makes for a perfect lead-in, especially if you're featuring an expert. One example, she was interviewing, she found out in the beginning that the interviewee, who is a VP at a company, likes to weave. And that became the introduction. It led to a whole a GIF and like an entire analogy that carried throughout the piece. And so always leave time for that off-topic banter. You never know what's going to come out of that. Number three is make the questions personal. So instead of asking the very general, very common questions that lead people to believe that maybe you didn't do your research, do enough research that you're asking things that you could only know if you read up on them. For example, hey, I hear that you weave. Number four, this is back to the John Carreyrou idea. If it's not clear to you, it's probably not clear. So I found this coaching writers who are just getting into the space, very often they'll assume that they should know, and so they don't ask the question. And almost always, if it's not clear to you, it's not clear to anyone else. And you really should, if you understand something, be able to explain it as if you were explaining it to a 4-year-old. So constant reminder to ourselves, always ask the question. If it's not clear, you can play dumb, say, hey, like, I'm kind of new to this space. Can you give that to me again? Because I'm not quite making the connection. And then finally, this is one I added in, ask questions that they have. So if you're talking to an expert, ask them what questions they're curious about. I did this with one of our interview series and talked to a Salesforce expert and asked him like, hey, what if you were running this series and you're talking to the next 5 people, what would your top question be? And his question was, people talk about Salesforce instances as being good or bad. How do you quantify that? And that question became the entire interview series that is still ongoing. And so that's a reminder to myself that if you do have a chance to talk to an expert, ask that expert what they would ask other experts. That's how you're going to get very quickly on their level. So number 4, go to where they gripe. This is an insight based on the fact that most of us have been to tech websites and spent 10 minutes there and left more confused and wondering, what on earth does this company do? I think it's because websites very often can't be honest. They're not clear and they're not very honest because they're trying to be everything to everyone, and that may serve a purpose in the marketing journey. It definitely doesn't help you when trying to research that company. So I would always encourage you, like, yes, glance at the website. Maybe they've done an uncommon job at being clear, but go to places where people really talk about this thing. My favorite place to go is Reddit. I think whether you're in the consumer or the tech or the B2B space, you're going to find incredibly candid comments about how people really use things, often from users. So there's several categories of interviewees for us in the B2B tech space, where you've got your leaders who are often fairly vague about the things that they talk about because they're such generalists. What I almost always want to hear from are the end users, and those are the people who are posting on Reddit and reviewing stuff and giving people very candid feedback. This whole list is useful. I would think if you're in the B2B tech space, Trust Radius, G2 Clutch, Gartner Peer Review are places where you can go where they're reviewing specific software or specific services. And if you're in the consumer space, Amazon reviews, Etsy reviews, anywhere that people can leave reviews Go there and filter by the 1 and 2 star reviews, and you will very quickly start to understand the things that people actually grapple with in this space. If you go far enough down that rabbit hole, you will often find links in those reviews to what I call insider diatribes. So this was one where we were doing research for a client that sells to scientists that do outsourced research and development. And this is an article by a scientist doing a sort of expose on the space, complaining about how much administrative work they have to do. It's like 2,000 words long, and this was by far the most useful artifact I found in this entire research project, because this is someone who is on the inside giving me all the information that I want to know, because they're frustrated. So when you do uncover these things, and often you will find them linked to in reviews or personal blogs, like these unlock everything for me, because they'll tell you so much about the perspective as well, right? Like, what did they talk about? What did they not talk about? And then how do they phrase the problems? So that's maybe one of the biggest values of these insider diatribes, is you get to figure out their vernacular for talking about those things and take notes, because then that informs how you talk about the space. 5, this one is pretty simple. Go find newsletters for that space. That's probably one of the best ongoing low effort ways to learn. Is behind every newsletter is a hopefully a smart person who lives in that space, is spending their full 40 hours a week looking at it, and then out of that pulling out 4 to 5 links for you to read. The value there is immense. If you sign up for 2 to 3 newsletters, you will very quickly start to figure out like what is interesting, right? Because the newsletter has to try to be interesting to its audience. So even if it's not all that useful for the research project, it at least tells you about the mindset of the people reading these newsletters. What stories do they share? What don't they share? You can save a lot of time that way. Similarly, you can follow people on LinkedIn and Twitter. There are free courses, there are paid courses. A lot of spaces, especially for us, because we're in the business to business world, there are industry bodies who are reflecting the news of the day back to their constituencies. For example, the American Association of Accountants or the National Retail Federation. Those I think are great places to go, even if they're a little jargon heavy, because they tell you so much about what people are thinking and care about. And then probably the most important point on this slide is sign up and try it. Anytime you have an opportunity to actually get into it, if it's a software, download the app. We were talking to a decentralized autonomous organization, or DAO, the other day. And so we signed up and went in there and created avatars before hopping on a call with them. That's one of the quickest ways to, if not to expertise, at least to general understanding, right? If you had trouble signing up for that thing, if you got in there and it wasn't what you expected, that can really flesh out your understanding. And then there's mining your extracurricular interests. So one sign I think of expertise is being able to explain a topic by way of analogy. If you understand it well enough to boil it down to a comparison to another discipline, that's when you're really starting to get things right. And the beauty of this is you can compare the discipline that you're studying to ones that you already know. So I find that when I'm reading about a new space, I'm often thinking like, oh, this is like that from psychology, or this is like that from software development. And I find that it feels like a bit of a hack, but by pulling those analogies into your writing, clients are often thrilled. So here's a screenshot from a client where I was writing about managing Salesforce, and came up with an analogy from a book that I had read like 5+ years ago, and that turned into an entire post for them. And I find that these things happen all the time. So here's 3 more examples. This is first one's an ebook. I drew it from a chapter in a book, Anti-Fragile, that I like a lot, that had really inspired me and stuck with me. And the scenario that the client was trying to talk about was so perfectly analogous to what was in Anti-Fragile, that the ebook was basically an homage to this work that already exists, is based on so much research and philosophy. And so I think makes for a very substantive ebook that didn't take a lot of research, because I already had this in the back of my mind. Second one here, the title is drawn from a Yeats poem. I felt that what we were talking about in this IT space was very analogous to what was happening in the poem The Second Coming. And then the third one here is a quote from mathematics. And so the recommendation here would be draw from your extracurricular interests to try to describe this new space that you're studying. And you can very quickly get to what feels like expertise by trying to find those analogies and pulling them in. So seventh and final, and this is maybe the most important one, is confirm that you got it. So I think that a lot of times research ends up inconclusive because you may do the research and then you write the thing and then you have to wait until it's published to see if you got it right. I think don't wait. If you have spent time cultivating the experts and they trust you, they think that you know enough that they're willing to share with you, ask them before things go live if you really did nail it. So we did this with a client where they had an SDR sequence that was getting about a 1% open rate. And we found a bunch of prospective buyers who had never heard of the company and interviewed them to figure out what their day was like. So we asked them, hey, can you show me an email from a business that you opened recently that you liked? Show me one that you hate. Where do you spend a lot of your time? If we're describing this general problem, like what percentage of your day does that actually occupy? So that we could figure out how to write the emails that are interrupting their day. After we wrote the emails, we shared it with them and said, hey, of these 3 emails, which of these would you open? And everyone laughed at number 3, and that's what we used, and increased the open rate from 1% to 34%. Anytime you have this opportunity to confirm it before it goes live, that's how you avoid, I think, a lot of the pain of, I don't want to say posing as an expert, but you're helping to communicate to people in this space, and you're taking on the mantle of being an expert to explain to them. I think this reduces a lot of, at least my anxiety around writing for a new space. So why become your own subject matter expert? Because 70% of that project is just back and forth. And the more you know, the faster everything goes, and the better it all turns out. And you avoid having your article eviscerated twice. So that's my presentation. So Tyler, I don't know if we can share this deck afterwards, but I have a couple of links here. And if this is interesting and you like things like this, we've got a newsletter, fenwick.media/newsletter for timeless writing and design wisdom.
Nice, man. That was really really awesome. I love all of the just like specific examples that you shared and sort of all the actionable tips. I think that's one of the hardest things, right? It's just like learning a new subject, right? It's like you need sort of these like little postmarks or benchmarks or whatever to like tell you like, are you doing the right thing? Are you heading in the right direction?
Right. Like, are the memes funny yet? If not, keep going.
Yeah, totally. I think that's just it's just so good, so relatable. I definitely have some questions that I'd love to ask as well. Yeah. And folks who are on the stream, please feel free to pop some questions in here for Chris. But yeah, definitely also check out the newsletter. I mean, just to toot the horn there of Fenwick, like they do amazing work and their own content is also amazing. So highly recommend, and certainly if you're looking to improve your skills as a writer, as a designer, as a strategist, just as a thinker, I think that's really what these guys do so well. Cool. Well, I wanted to ask a question. So my one of the takeaways that I had from the presentation was you talked about, I think sort of 2 stages, right? So there's sort of the becoming an expert or gathering expertise in the early stages, which you sort of talked about these tactics for interviewing and asking questions and sort of learning in the beginning, and then on the back end sort of validating those ideas. So I was just curious, like, first of all, do you have any tips for setting up those initial discussions or getting connecting with people early on? I think that's one thing that is a sort of perpetual struggle for me personally and for folks that I've worked with, is that you don't want to ask too much. Like, you don't want to take too much time from people. So how do you sort of frame that to really get the maximum value without asking for too much from them?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question. I think that, I guess it really depends on the relationship, right? If you're an in-house content writer, maybe a very different thing than if you're an outsourced writer or freelancer. For us, a lot of the times, we make it a requirement for working with a new client that they do have experts. So that's one of our qualification questions is, if we're going to write about this space, who is our resource, who we can lean on, and do they know that this is coming? Which I think is a very important question, because we've definitely gotten to situations where, I'm thinking about one IT company in particular. They had the experts on security matters, and those experts just had no time. And they both wanted to participate. And so they would say, like, sure, I will contribute to this thing. And months would go by before they actually found the time to do it. I think that the best way probably to get experts involved is to help them build their own profile. So if they have an interest in sharing things with others, doing the ghostwriting so that their name is on it is one way, to get them to participate, because it helps their career. I don't think it hurts the marketing organization. If anything, it helps it, because having a very credible author behind this is great. And it's also going to make them, because they have skin in the game, a lot more detail oriented about what gets said. So they're not going to let things get through that are not true. In terms of supplementing, like what I would call those core content experts who are in-house, that's a tough thing. Like, next we would go to my network and ask around and see if there are people that I can think of who do a similar job, and then ask them for a 30 minutes informational interview. I've been shocked at how open people are to do that. A lot of the work that we do too with a new client, often I'll just go to LinkedIn and I'll run a search for people with that title. I was a salesperson in the past, and so I have thousands of LinkedIn connections who I have no idea who they are. But very often, people want to talk about what they do. And I think that as a writer, you'll often be surprised at people's willingness to share for no particular reason other than to be helpful. And it also, like, it can help their career too. So a lot of times we find these people through the network who then want to contribute, and we can pull them in and quote them in materials that helps them build their career, build their own profile. And they also just want to explain things, like having to talk through your job. I think there's probably a dearth of listening these days, and people just like want an opportunity to talk it through because it helps them think it through, right? Sometimes talking to an expert in our network about a client we're writing about gets them to think like, wow, I do know a lot about this and it didn't occur to me. I'm so in the weeds on this every single day that like, I have a lot of thoughts. And then they've begun blogging.
Wow.
In terms of offering things to get those people to take that conversation, I have found that offering nothing is the best thing. We've offered gift cards, we've offered kickbacks, and I think that offering something small often cheapens it. People are much more interested in the career potential, and if not that, just doing it for the sake of doing it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think too, one thing that I find, and I'd be interested if you have the same experience, is that it may appear initially that the easiest path is to do something like asynchronous, like send them an email or like ask them for input on something, like, but it's a lot of times that actually becomes more of a burden than just like getting on a 30-minute call. Do you find that same thing?
Oh, interesting. Yeah. I mean, I think this might vary for each person on our team. I really prefer the asynchronous because I don't think things through on a call. And we do have some clients who they want to talk things through, and that's how they arrive at the solution. And for me, I have to do it on my own. So the way that we think about it is we call it task tennis. The project is either in my court or it's in your court, and we're both responsible for letting the other person know when it's been passed back. But very often, I want an internal point of contact at the client to do a lot of the management for us, because we don't want to take on the chasing. So we'll have a director of content, a director of marketing, whose job it is to get that person to respond. And then I want their entire team to get clear in the Google comments before they send something back to me. For example, if I talk to a subject matter expert and we do a 30-minute phone call and they're really excited about this idea and I'm excited about the idea, and then I write it up and then I send it to the director of content. The director of content goes, that's kind of sensitive. We can't talk about that. We're about to IPO. That's off the table. I find it creates a lot more back and forth than if I hit the ball over to them and I say, your team, tell us when you're done. Come to something on this, which works really well when your point of contact has the deadline. So I think it is a long rotund way of saying that we really rely on our clients to do a lot of the internal project management so that we don't have to do the chasing. But then, there's definitely value to talking things through. And we may find that with some clients that if that is their preferred medium, we'll always hop on. But I like to do things asynchronously.
Interesting. Yeah. Okay. That is true. I guess it does depend on the person's level of engagement with the process and sort of what their day-to-day looks like. If it's like constant fires, then it's a little harder to get them to respond to last comments or whatever.
Totally.
That's interesting. What could you characterize for us, like what would you say sort of like the proportion of kind of this research and talking to people and really like collecting this expertise to like doing the actual writing for your team?
Yeah. So the way that we work with clients is we start any client engagement off with this research. So we will start with something we call an insight report, where if the client signs up, we need 3 to 4 weeks to just figure out what it is that they do, which means interviewing them. It means checking out their product. It means finding these interviewees who have never heard of them to ask them about their day. And once we have that body of knowledge, we produce this guide that's like a 10 to 15 page document that tells us everything we need to know about content marketing to that client. And that's our prerequisite before working with them at all. From there, we would then go into actual creating the content. And so that initial research portion, very heavy on content on the research part. Once we get into actual everyday articles, then I would say it's probably like, if we've done a good job, it's like a third research and it's 2/3 writing, editing, reviewing, everything else that follows. If I didn't have that initial research portion, I think that that would be very different. And we would do a lot more research per article.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so you guys try to kind of front load as much of that like knowledge gathering as you possibly can.
Yeah, that's always the hope, because I think that what we want to develop, and part of this whole developing expertise, is like knowing what's interesting and what's not interesting. I noticed you chuckled when I was talking about the introduction, where it's just the writer basically explaining the topic to themselves. I think that's like the thing we are so trying to avoid. If a client hires us to write to an expert audience, we need to know what topics are interesting, right? And so like all of this backs up to like, hey, let's figure it all out at the front, so that we're on the level that we need to be on, so then we can decide what topic is even interesting and worth researching before we go into it.
Yeah. That makes a ton of sense. So one other question I was curious about is, I'm in this process. I think you learn a lot. You get a lot of ideas about certain topics or things that you want to explore that you think would be interesting to the audience. How does your team sort of match that up with like sort of marketing stuff, like keyword research, that kind of thing? Or is that part of your process?
Yeah, I would actually love to hear how you guys do this too. It all depends on the type of content. We recently did a retrospective for all of 2021, and we asked like, hey, what were the favorite things you created? And across the board, they were the things that were unrelated to marketing jargon, right? And there is always this negotiation that's happening. I think that we like to think that we are first and foremost advocates for the reader. So I use this word fiduciary. Like in the financial world, you have this idea that you could have an advisor who has a fiduciary duty to do the right thing for you, no matter what. Even if they are being compensated by the bank for selling these particular financial products, like their duty is to do the right thing, like to give you the correct investments. And I think of us as being that advocate and that fiduciary expert for the reader, not for the marketer. Because very often the marketer is tied to metrics that I think are that can be destructive if you focus too much on them. So like we want them focused on the metrics, we want them focused on the publication times and the calendar, but we really want to do what's right for the reader. Because if we excite the reader, all else is forgiven. We hit all of our marketing goals, right? People come back, they like it, they share, like all the good things come out of it. And so we do SEO and insert marketing speak only so much that it's helpful for the reader. Right? Sometimes there's an article where the entire point is to explain the product. Like we're going to get very deep into the product, but for the most part, we want to explain things as the reader would understand them. And because that's what matters. If we get that right, then all else falls into place. And we do a lot of talking about SEO these days. Google's really smart. And it makes like 600 plus algorithm changes a year. There's 1,000 people on the Google search team as engineers. I just don't think any hacks are going to outsmart Google. And Google, like it's trying to figure out, like, did someone read this thing and click to read more? And if we're doing really good writing, that is really good search engine optimization. This is not to say there's not a lot of technical things you can do, but we will focus on keywords only insofar as that is helpful to the reader. Like, is the reader searching for this particular term? It will be very helpful to them to see that in the title. They'll know they've landed on the right place. So that's how we think about it, more than like, how do we get the keywords in here?
Yeah,
But
No,
I would be curious to know, like, what is your process at Optimus? Like, how do you think about incorporating and balancing and negotiating those?
Yeah, I would say we lean more heavily into SEO as sort of the foundation of what we're doing and how we're sort of scoping out and planning the work that we do. We, basically what we try to do is, based on our initial research, our initial discovery, we use sort of a jobs to be done kind of a process that we go through based on sort of the product, and then use that to kind of feed the keyword research, right? So we're starting with sort of a bottoms up approach to sort of understand like who's the buyer, what is their journey, what are their pain points, like what are the problems that they experience that are again sort of relate in some way to this product and its specific features, and then from there doing keyword research to identify like, okay, what are the keywords, what are the queries that people are actually looking for. That's for most of our clients, and it does vary depending on sort of what the goals are for the client, but I would say most of the people who come through the door to work with Optimist are thinking about SEO and they're thinking about search in particular. And so that has to be sort of baked into the strategy. And we have to be able to say, hey, not only do we make good content, but we now rank for these 20 keywords or whatever. So, but to go back to your point, Chris, I think my philosophy and my approach to SEO has always been like humans first. Like think about the reader. Any like sort of quote unquote best practice for SEO should have sort of a human logic behind it. Like, why is this better for the reader? Why does this serve the reader in some way? And if it doesn't, then you're exactly right. It's probably one of the things that's going to get hit in that algorithm update, and you're going to be crying next month because all your search rankings dropped, right? So, like, if you can't look at that and say, like, hey, we did this for SEO, but also, and more importantly, because it serves the reader in some very specific way, I think that's always the key, in my opinion, to sort of finding that balance for sure.
Yeah, and I think that's it's so relevant to this conversation because SEO fundamentally is a question of, are you answering questions better than others, which comes back to this expertise, So like when you are doing the keyword research, how do you balance that, finding that expertise to share, especially when you have a client who sort of just expects these things to happen. They're like, hey, if you write the things, it will work. Like, how do you balance enough research, enough, getting into the expertise?
Yeah, I mean, it's challenging. I mean, it's really I think it's a two-part problem, right? So I think you have the initial challenge, which is identifying like specific topics and things like that. And I think like that's where keyword research for us is also like a learning tool, right? Like we're learning a lot about the industry based on what people are putting into Google, and like, okay, like they're not just looking for what is this topic, but they're looking for how is it calculated, or how do I measure this, or whatever. Like these are the questions that people have. And so at a high level, from like a sort of a strategic perspective, it's giving us a lot of insight about sort of the shape of this topic and like what people are looking for and what like nuance and facets they're interested in. And then I think the other piece is more tactical. So on like a sort of an individual article level, as we're thinking about SEO, I think a big part of this, and to Google's credit, like they're getting better at identifying like based on the query, like what information should actually be in this article, like what questions do people have, what topics are they trying to cover, and that ranges there's a gamut there as well, right? Because you do have people who are just looking for what is RevOps, right, and they want the very basic, and that's not a deep expert level article. It's like a high level, like I'm a newbie, I'm trying to understand the basics, and then you have whatever some deep long tail keyword that's like very specific and very precise and very expert level. And so as we think about SEO for an individual query, we're sort of forced to unpack the search intent and the user behind that, and like who are these people and what level of knowledge do they have and what level of knowledge are they looking for. So that's sort of how we it's always a mixture of like art and science, right? Like every piece of content, every content marketing is like, there's no set way. I can't say like follow A, B, and C and it's done. Like there's definitely a mixture of and a balance to strike there. Right.
Yeah, I mean, that is a very interesting perspective. You're looking at what's being searched as sort of like a map of what questions people are asking. I think I maybe have over-indexed on the side of like, I'm trying so hard to get to the ungoogleable things, like that I want the insider diatribe that does not rank, but is like totally. Is the deep the deep source of knowledge. It's maybe something we could spend more time on, is
Well,
thinking about how do those questions guide.
yeah, and I certainly don't think it's one or the other. I think it's both, and it depends on the strategy, and depends on the business, right? Like we work with a lot of companies that are like early stage startups. They don't have an audience. Like they have to use Google because they don't have any other way to get in front of these people. And
Right.
so like the only thing we can do is try to identify where that existing demand is. Whereas I think of the work that you guys do more on like the other side, where it's like, hey, we've got an audience of people. Like we need to keep these people engaged. We need to help them understand the product. We need to speak on their level. I think at a deeper level, to be honest.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's so interesting. Like there are so many instances with early startups where they don't have the expert on the team. That's just, for
Mm-hmm.
me, that's the hardest content marketing play, is we need to develop a deep base of knowledge for these RevOps experts. Let's say, where's the RevOps expert? They're not on the team. Like, wow. Like we certainly
Mm-hmm.
can't bring that. We will, as much as we can, try to bring that, but finding and identifying those sources and bringing them into the company is
Yeah.
such a priority. And I think it's part of why I've seen a lot of clients develop client advisory boards, where they're not going to hire the person, but they're going to find a bunch of potential buyers at different companies, bring them in, make them quote unquote advisors to the company, and then involve them in content. So like now, okay, great, I have a network of 8 people I can run things by, as opposed to what can you find on Google, to your
Right.
point,
Right.
there has to be so many facets that you attack that question from.
No, 100%, 100%. And I think it's also an evolution. Ideally, even if clients start with us and we're really focused on SEO and bringing in traffic that way, if we're successful at building an audience, then you have sort of that audience of experts that you are talking to at a deeper level, and you don't have to rely on Google. You don't have to necessarily think about keywords. You can think just about like what matters to these people that are on our email list, or whatever it is.
Right. Right. And then of course there's the matter of like developing the writers so that they do have some domain expertise, that you are coming in from some baseline of knowledge, right? Like we very early on only had folks who came from B2B, and we've started to expand beyond that. But that was important for us as like a value proposition for our clients, is we understand MarTech. I used to work at a MarTech company. I can write for your MarTech audience. I get what they care about, what they don't care about. But it is evolution of like, yeah, helping the client develop, also helping our writers develop, so that we do have that expertise, that we can repeat that for future clients for different areas.
Totally, totally. Yeah, that's actually an interesting point too. I'd love to learn a little bit more. You mentioned sort of doing this deep dive early on with the client, and really sort of gathering this, and then it sounds like there's a kind of a deliverable there that is sort of like a handbook to that
Yep.
audience and that business. Is that like a living document? Like, how do you guys update that, or how does it evolve as you work with the client?
Yeah. It is meant to be a living document. It's rarely updated, but it often does serve a lot of different purposes. So for to be honest, the way that this developed is that, so my wife is our chief strategy officer, and she noticed that I was doing a tremendous amount of research before we would get signed with a client, and I would just go and pour time into Reddit threads and just like, how can I get up to speed on this thing? And her insight was, she was like, why don't you charge for that? And so I started charging for that, and it's like, it's a significant portion of our revenue now, and people love it. It produces this document that is more or less a Bible of information. Hey, here's the way that people talk about this. I'm noticing this sentiment of sarcasm that like maybe we should touch on in some of our content we create. The intent is to help us come in at the expert level, whatever the audience level needs us to be, so that we're not writing for a healthcare company and calling patients customers, right? Or like whatever version of that for that industry.
Yeah. Yep.
And then the feedback we've gotten from clients is, so we'll create it. We'll try to be as opinionated as possible in it, to a fault, because we want it to generate discussion. So we want to come back to the clients and say, hey, we looked at all of your marketing, your competitors' marketing. I think we're way behind. Here's where we're way behind. Here's what's not clear to me. And I want them to react to it, and that to inform the strategy from there. So we'll often in that offer a menu of items. Hey, here's the challenges that we see. Here's the things we have going for us. Here's the 12 things that we think we could do, and they get to choose. Hey, let's do 3 and 12 and see how those go from there. And then I think the great feedback on that is that ends up being really useful for onboarding more team members. So we're like, as a team of only 9 people, we very quickly cannot scale for a client that's growing fast. And so we want to help them hire, and that becomes a great way to onboard that new person. hey, what's everything you need to know about marketing to this audience? Here it is in a 15-page report. We even had folks use that for onboarding product people. Hey, do you want to know how we're marketing this thing? Like, here's the guide to that. I aspire to get to a point where we have enough resources to come back and do that periodically. Like every 6-12 months is like a check-in, but it very often is like a point in time study.
Yeah, I think that's always one of the big challenges is like how do you educate your team and make sure that everyone has a base level of knowledge, but then also not let that knowledge get like locked into the people's brains too much, because I think like that's a perpetual challenge that we deal with too, is like we've got somebody who's been writing for this client forever and they're going on vacation for a month, and like we need somebody else to like step in for a certain project or something, and like how do we get as much of that information as possible out of their brain and into something that like gives them at least like a baseline or a foundation to learn about that client or that topic. And I haven't found an easy answer to that either.
I don't have an answer either, but I would love to hear when someone does have an answer. We also have the issue of our writers have pointed out that it's nice to rotate through things. So the expert on chatbots does not just want to write about chatbots. They need to cycle through things. And I had this early on with a client. I'm like, wow, this is article number 110 on chatbots. I'm out of ideas. I just have like, there's nothing left. We have to hand this off to someone else and allow them to develop their own perspective on this and expertise in this area. Because, we've got to enjoy what we're doing. Fundamentally, we have to enjoy the work. We have to enjoy the research. And so there's that balance of getting really good at a thing, but also constantly practicing several things and rotating out of that client.
Well, yeah, and you mentioned too in the presentation here about pulling in your hobbies and like drawing from other things, and I think like that's another huge advantage for writers and for strategists and anybody involved in this. Is like the more sort of perspective you get on from different angles and different industries and things, like I think you can start to apply that and see different patterns that you wouldn't have recognized, even if it's not directly applicable, right? So you might do chatbots and you learn something that becomes applicable about RevOps or whatever, in sort of a weird, like tangential way a lot of times too, where you are bringing like a fresh perspective that somebody else who is only focused on that topic might not have picked up on.
Yeah. And I find that almost the weirder and the more differentiated the space is, the better. Right? Like somebody talking about dancing and RevOps, like that's where the real magic, I think, happens. Those are really interesting analogies.
100%. Yeah.
It can become a crutch. I think that the first couple of articles that I ever wrote were, I love history, and they were all about like biographies of presidents, and like, wow, is that formula like a little overdone for me at the beginning? But it's useful. And I'm seeing in the comments that folks are saying that they find it useful too. Yeah, the rotation is key to staying interested.
For sure. And I just want to make a note for our freelance and agency folks here, because I think you made an important point that is not really relevant to this discussion, but you said, hey, I used to spend all this time doing all this research and now we charge for it. And I personally am a big proponent of the idea, like, don't work for free for clients. So if you're a freelancer or agency person, take note, like there's a lot of value in that research and that understanding, and it's worth money. So
it's not even worth money too, but like it also will it'll convey to the clients that you have a lot of value. If they come in and they say, hey, we need 10 blog posts, and you say, I don't do that until I have time to research, you will lose some clients, and the ones that you keep will deeply value you as an expert in a way that will completely make up for any clients that you lose. And that has been our experience is if you can promise the best possible work and you're sort of weirdly limited in all these ways, but like that does the best work, they're very open to that. They just don't know what to ask for. And if you can offer that, I think it's a lot of value.
100%. Chris, I just have one last question for you. And again, folks, if you have questions in the chat, throw them in now, or we're running down on the clock here. So it's about personas. Is that something that works into this? I feel like there's a sort of a growing distaste for the idea of kind of quote unquote traditional personas. How do you think about that?
It's like the word content. I resent it because I think that there's something better out there and I don't know what that thing is. So personas are like, it's on our wish list of things we want. Like we want the personas. What I find is wrong with most personas is that they get so generalized as to no longer be useful. So they have the name, it's like, Mary marketer, and the things that they say about her are like, likes to succeed at her job, follows KPIs, and it becomes things that just like, the Turing test for us is, can I write an article for Mary? Of course, I have no idea who Mary is. The really good personas that we have are where the clients have a product marketing team who goes really into the weeds and then fills it with first person anecdotes and quotes. And so one that I'm thinking of was for a CTO, and one of our clients had hired an agency to do very extensive persona research. And the persona deck was like 100 pages long and full of just first person quotes. That was immensely useful for us. Like the CTO saying, my job is to keep the CEO out of the headlines. That is forever stuck with me when I'm writing about CTOs. And so I think they can be really, really useful. I think most personas, in my experience, that we get handed by clients, where they say, of course we have personas, they're here, and I see them and I go, oh no, this is not what we need. They can be done really, really well. They just have to, I think, have those first person quotes.
Yeah, 100%.
What about, what is your take on them?
Yeah, I would say it's sort of similar. I mean, I think the, a lot of the templates and stuff that people follow are very antiquated and not very valuable. I would say, we price it somewhere in the middle there. We, I won't say that we have like the most sophisticated researcher or like persona process in the world, but we do, we really try to understand the reader more so through the lens of like the specific product that the company is selling and what they're, and again, I think a lot of that is colored by the fact that we're thinking about SEO. So we're trying to think about like, what would they sit down and type into Google that would actually be relevant to them. And so we use sort of a jobs to be done kind of framework. So we don't really like sit down and like map out like, hey, it's Mary the marketer and here's what she thinks about it. We do say, okay, one of our audiences is marketers and here are the features that they are using and here's what we know about that. And we also use, I like the example that you gave of sort of doing like the research on Reddit and like through reviews and stuff. I also love that. And especially for getting that very specific language, right? So that's where you're going to find like, hey, I'm trying to hit this very specific metric that is associated with my job role in this niche industry. And like, I would have never understood that from just keyword research, right? I had to see like the firsthand information from that actual user.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. There's a better way to do it out there, but I don't know what that way is. And if we do have it's rarely unhelpful. But the really good ones, I think, are useful for us.
100%. Yep.
Yeah.
Awesome, man. Well, we just got a couple minutes left here. Any final thoughts, ideas, or parting wisdom for the group here?
Yeah, I think the only thing that comes to mind is the first point. It's like, it really just comes down to curiosity. We talk about that a lot, and when we're hiring, like, that is the thing that we keep coming back to is, we can teach a lot of things. We cannot teach curiosity, and curiosity generally will lead the smart person, no matter their level of expertise in the area, to an interesting place, is constantly asking those questions. And so I think that having the courage to ask those questions on the subject matter expert interviews is really important, because if you get caught up in thinking that you should know, or you're going to offend them by asking, like, just ask, always ask, and ask more questions, because with the interview, you often only get one shot. So get as much as you can on that transcript.
For sure. That's great. Yeah. Awesome. Well, Chris, thank you again so much for taking the time today. Thanks for sharing all of these ideas with us. As you can see on the screen here, check out fenwick.media/newsletter, get subscribed to Chris's and his team's writing. There's the URL again. And also, if you have not already, please like and subscribe on our YouTube here, and find us in the top of the funnel group. Chris is also a member there, so if you have any questions for Chris, I'm sure he'd be happy to chat with you on Slack. Again, Chris, just thank you so much. Really appreciate your time, and hope you have a great rest of the day.
Thanks so much, Tyler. Thank you, everyone. Take care and have a good one.
Cheers.